Yeah, thanks for agreeing to chat with me, dude.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, where do you want to start? I was thinking, I'm very interested in your recent book, not just the content of the book and, whatever your thoughts might be, which we should explore. But, I think something you and I both have in common is that I think we're in our own ways interested in novel forms of, financially sustaining different types of activities, whether in your case it be, design criticism, or in my case, I'm kind of trying to think through what might like a truly 21st century academic look like in terms of funding models and monetization models. You're clearly thinking a lot about that. And I was quite impressed by your recent book launch, which has quite a, I think, thoughtful and clearly somewhat strategized and sophisticated way of uh, seeking to fund itself and lay itself out. Could you share with us a little bit about that? Would you like to talk about that for a little bit?
Sure. So I've been writing for a few years now, and I guess the interesting thing about this book is it's really the first time that I've put out a paid product. I've done sponsored posts before, sponsored series, and in particular, I don't know how much this maps on to what you're doing in terms of academia, but there's possibility. I really can't say to the space that you're in,
Sure.
meta politics or philosophy, what the monetization options are there with sponsors. Who knows? Maybe there are some institutions that do that. But in
Yeah, no,
design,
I'd rather hear from your perspective how you see your game and how you're playing
Yeah,
it, like your strategic insights, and then I can think about how they may or may not cross over, and other people can,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. You can tell us how they map onto things. But
Sure.
yeah, so in design, there's a lot of, I guess you could say, like app companies. I'm not really interested so much in, or I haven't so far been interested in that Casper type of like Squarespace. I mean, neither of them would be bad sponsors to have, but so far those haven't been the people who've been interested in sponsoring. Um, I've also used, generally it's been apps, whether it be iOS, Mac, web apps, or even just generally companies in the design and tech space that have sponsored. And they've been on for whether it be the podcast that I run, which has been defunct for a bit, but it'll be back soon enough, as well as just blog posts. But this time was a little bit interesting, trying something new, doing a book. Previously, I'd done multi-part series that were many thousands of words, tens of thousands of words, and just kind of monetized it through sponsorships. And this time I tried doing it with just asking the public, saying, hey, if people are interested in supporting, let's see how this works. And it's been a great response so far, really great reviews. And some interesting corroboration from internally. I've gotten a few people from Uber who have reached out via DMs and told me that it definitely resonates with their experience. And so the book is called Uber's Undoing, and it's basically it's a history of how Uber design came to their current logo, but also, and not just their logo, their icon and everything that goes into it, whether it be the color palette, patterns, everything along those lines. But yeah, basically, it's been an interesting experiment. I wouldn't say that this first one is going to set me off to writing full time, immediately, but I think it's definitely validating, and it's been, multiple of what I expected. So definitely really happy with how things are going.
So I think a fair number of my listeners are actually, bloggers and different types of creative intellectuals in their own right. And so since this is also something I'm actively thinking a lot about right now and kind of developing in my own way, I would love, if you don't mind, could we chat about this a little bit in more depth? Can I ask you some questions about
Sure.
your model here? Because I'm kind of curious the strategic insights that went into it, and also kind of how it's working out for you, and if you have any kind of lessons about it. So one thing, just first, would you mind telling the listeners uh, how you decided to kind of unroll this book and fund it?
Sure. In terms of, I guess maybe if you can clarify, when you say, you mean like the launch plan, or?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you what I know. I mean, just from watching what you've been doing, it looks to me like you have it's a clever sort of model. If I recall correctly, what
Okay,
you're
okay.
doing is you have written a book in full,
Mhm.
and the way that you're kind of presenting it to the world is you are doing it in basically a series of blog posts that are spaced out over time. But what you're telling people with the launch of the first blog post is if they want this in a ebook format, they can just cough up $3 right now and get it in a nice book format. or everyone can get it for free. They just have to wait a couple weeks for each following post. Is that the basic idea?
Yeah, exactly. And it's 1 week between, but it really doesn't matter. The main thing is you got it all solid, is putting it out in sequence. And, I've had some feedback from some other people in our sphere, I don't want to name names, but some people who are relatively mainstream, who have been interested in this model for sure. And, maybe there actually were some academics who were interested in this. But in any case, the idea, yeah, I think I didn't realize how much interest there would be in the model. That's been, I wouldn't say half, but it's been a large portion of interest is people saying, wow, I haven't seen this before. And, I didn't really think of it too deeply. It just kind of came about. I was thinking, this has been consistent throughout my writing career, is not wanting to limit the exposure, because really it's about the ideas. I do have a job, and I want to start a conversation with what I'm writing about. And I think that's true for most writers. If everyone could have health, this is not like some crypto communist thing coming out, but I'm sure many writers, if they could have all their basics covered, would just be in it for the writing. That's pretty consistent. But in any case, the main thing is, as far as that goes, I've got my expenses covered and I really want the ideas out there. That said, if I could do this full time, that would be exciting. And so this is just a way to validate what's the first interest. I'm not sure I'm going to go with this model again. I might. I really have to think about it depending on what the next product is, whether it's a book of this length. If it's much bigger, then maybe this doesn't make sense. If it's about this length, it could make sense. I'm still trying to think about even, if it's half as big, is it worth putting out in this type of sequence, or maybe just doing a paywall? The main thing with paywalls is they just prevent people from accessing it. And if people know that it's going to come out, they might not pay. But some people have said that they appreciated the idea that it was coming out for free for everybody, and that gave them an incentive to be like, let me support this and not just leech onto this, basically.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree with the intuition that anything that involves some sort of hard idea of keeping something locked up is kind of doomed, right?
Yep.
That I think misses the point of the internet, and it's both impractical because you kind of, information will be free, it wants to be free, and it will make itself free eventually, but it kind of misses the whole point that if you throw yourself with the current of free information, you end up, making people happier, and also you end up doing better for yourself anyway. I think
Right.
I think that's a pretty strong lesson of the past few years if you watch what types of projects succeed and which fail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
Go on.
didn't have anything. Go for it.
Okay, yeah. So would you say that you're are you pleasantly surprised with how much you've been earning from it, or are you underwhelmed, or about what you expected?
It's definitely a lot higher than I expected, but
Oh yeah,
certainly not something that I think anybody who is making an income would say, oh, I'm going to quit my job over it right
sure.
now.
Well, how many words is the book?
Book is approximately 9,000 words. It's
Okay, yeah,
it's like more of a pamphlet size thing, but
yeah, exactly. So that's very short. So like something I've been thinking a lot about is the ideal funding model for doing purely intellectual work is highly contingent on your kind of temperament and traits as a producer. So some people are more foxes, and some people are more hedgehogs, and some people like to do high volume consistently. Some people like to do a whole lot of research and produce these like very short but highly concentrated, polished things. Like there are different people have different strengths and weaknesses. But like 9,000 words, that's, as you say, that's more like a pamphlet. You know, you might not be making that much on that pamphlet, but depending on how you're constituted in terms of your productivity and how many ideas you have, if you did one of those a month, you know what I mean? Then maybe all of a sudden you start doing the math and you're kind of like, okay, maybe, it's maybe small pieces that only bring in a little bit of money per piece. If you do them at volume, especially if they're evergreen and they kind of sit around for a little while, and people might buy them over time and not just for like a timely occasion. You can imagine, I think that sort of thing taking off a little bit more effectively than, you're even maybe giving it credit for. It sounds like,
I think that's totally valid. And it's also something you've spoken about before, is the idea of multiple revenue streams. I mean, this is not rocket science, but even if one thing you could do once a month, and then you could also do two other things, and different people are interested in each one, or you put together your package, whatever it might be. But and I really I'm trying to think about, but the one thing that I think really makes it work in my case is the sponsors. That definitely is key. So maybe over time, if I'm consistent with doing something, delivering something of this level more often, then I think it could potentially grow into that. But sponsors made it work for this for sure.
That's cool. Yeah, that's awesome. It's interesting. Sponsorship is an interesting model because you obviously don't see that with a much kind of. I've seen it in the kinds of domains that you're in, but you don't see that with my type of work.
Right.
But it's funny. I've been watching a lot of skateboard videos. This is totally apropos of nothing. But I was like a skater punk my whole life, and I used to watch skateboard videos and love skaters. And that whole model is kind of based on company sponsorships, and as many sports are, right? And I've been watching all these skateboard documentaries, and I have been kind of wondering, like, it would be really cool if like intellectuals had teams, it totally doesn't really, I mean, it's hard to imagine, but you do actually kind of see weird possible experiments with this. Like, it's not academia, obviously, and it's not like high level prestige intellectual work, but you're now seeing nowadays like social media labels. Have you ever heard of this?
I haven't. I'm
So, like,
imagining it's something on like Instagram or something, or
it's mostly like YouTube, I think. Like some of the big YouTubers, they have they start a label. So basically, like, you get a certain amount of influence as your own kind of like content creator, and then with your name and your reach, you basically look for like talented younger people, and you bring them onto your label. You basically invite them to live in your like mansion in LA or whatever it might be, and or you just give them money you give them support for them to make their stuff, and then it has the label, it has your logo and your name and everything on it, and all to the greater glory of the label. It's just like what you see like with music, basically. You know how that model works, the recording industry. You kind of you use your standing to basically invest in newer people, and then you have this kind of thing going. But I was thinking, like, it's not totally insane to imagine that happening with like bloggers. Like, skateboarders go on tour also. So it's like you have a team, you have a kind of like brand, and you make videos and you sell the videos. Like that, for a while, that was like the model. But you also go on tour and you like sell the merch and stuff like that. Like, you could imagine, you seriously could imagine. I mean, like some like highbrow, like really legit, super smart, intellectual people who maybe have some overlapping interests in common, but they do different stuff. They're individuals with their own platforms and agendas, but they're just somewhat aligned. And you kind of like, you get like a tour bus and you drive around like the country doing like paid events. So like you do talks that are paid events, and everything gets recorded for like YouTube and podcasts and stuff like that. And you sell books and stuff like that. I mean, you could imagine it. It's not that far fetched. Might sound kind of silly because if you're like in a prestige circle like I am, like in academia, if you were to try to do a lot of the stuff, it just sounds like vulgar, right? It sounds lowbrow. Right. But I mean, like, with the spread of things like YouTube, I think like there's going to be a major reckoning between the highbrow and the lowbrow in a kind of increasingly flat, kind of like middle brow media, I think. And it, I don't think that means you have to like sacrifice or skimp or compromise on the high level intellectual commitments and value and rigor. It just means you might have to start experimenting with formats that historically have been looked at as vulgar, but in the future, they won't be vulgar. They'll just be the normal way that all creative people make things and do things and sustain themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting that I think it's new, and certainly in the case of YouTube and YouTubers, but I think one sort of public intellectual that's definitely been doing that recently is Jordan Peterson, and he's doing all these book tours. That's true. That's probably part of the crew that you're referring to. But even if you go back a decade, like the whole New Atheists, Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and all them, they were and Dan Dennett. I mean, I remember growing up in Boston that Dan Dennett did some talk at, I think, the Harvard bookstore. Like that kind of thing. Author tours, and I think it's just on steroids now, where he couldn't do Patreon in addition to that. It was just kind of, he had his book deal and he had, relationships with bookstores or things on that level. But now he can control that, and presumably somebody who is enterprising could do that. I'm not sure necessarily. I think it's sort of design is very insular, and I think probably similarly to academia, where you have to have the right relationships with the right people. There's tons of conferences in design with tons of money being pumped in. Could be Adobe or just any number of big design companies run giant conferences. And if you have pleasant relationships with the right people, you can be on that tour. And you may not even have to do any infrastructure building on your own. You just kind of go from place to place doing the same talk, or every year you come up with a new talk. I don't know how profitable that is. I think that's part of people's income stream, but I think these are definitely avenues that are growing, and they map onto things in history and what people have done for decades. But there's a new twist on it now that I think content creators have more control over that experimentation, and probably getting more of a cut because they don't have as many middlemen, basically.
Oh yeah, well that's for sure. The cut that they get is much bigger. I mean, I've done a little bit of research into the current industry of self-publishing versus traditional publishing, and when you actually look at the numbers, it's pretty remarkable. Like,
yeah.
I think we're basically at a point now where the self-publishing for most cases, self-publishing is actually more successful in terms of reach and impact, and in terms of money. The actual, like, what a kind of traditional publisher can give you, even the big ones, is relatively small compared to what entrepreneurial self-publishers are doing right now. So yeah, I think the tide is shifting in a major way.
Definitely.
So do you want to, Eli, maybe give us your pitch about Uber? Do you want to kind of tell us what's the overall idea of your book, and how do you see Uber, or what's the idea behind it?
I mean, Uber, not to, I guess, I'm not going to hedge this here. Uber's basically a clusterfuck, but they've been that way for a long time. And I think it's not entirely false that the company has a big mess on its hands, but it's also been a little bit blown out of proportion. I mean, certainly they've had massively irresponsible executives. They've had tons of scandals that probably would have plagued any company. But I think the nature of the response from journalists has been very specific, and it's not. I think if you look at something like Snapchat, Evan Spiegel, he's had his own, his own little kerfuffles or whatever you might say, and they still have a genuinely positive perception. People don't think of them as a bad company, and I mean, I don't think they deserve to be thought of per se. Although I haven't done a huge amount of studying Snapchat, but in any case, Uber's had countless numbers of scandals, and it's basically gotten to the point where the executives and the board of directors wanted Travis Kalanick. I don't know how to pronounce his name, Kalanick or Kalanick, but in any case, he was pushed out, and this was celebrated by almost everyone. I mean, he was responsible for a lot of things, but in many ways it was symbolic. So before he got pushed out, he did this whole massive rebrand, and it was a very patronizing rebrand. I mean, a lot of design companies, the main mission of a rebrand is to reset perceptions, and usually it doesn't have much to do with aesthetics at all. I mean, many times they have great aesthetics, but in general, it's about reshaping what people think about the company. And in their case, it was patronizing because instead of taking a position on what Uber meant to the world, they basically said, well, Uber is everything for everyone. And so they had a different color for every country and every city. They had, I think it was like 484 colors for each city would have its own color palette. And then each city has its own pattern. And America's one was one of the American ones was like power lines and power stations, the poles in sort of, you can think of the Midwest. And that was the pattern because that somehow represents America. I mean, it essentially was just kind of nonsense. In any case, so at some point, Travis was kicked out, and new CEO came in. The interesting thing about that transition was that the guy was handpicked by Travis. He was not some independent guy. I mean, I believe he was from Cisco, but I could be wrong about that. And in any case, it wasn't so important where he was from. He was at a different company. He was brought in to reset expectations, and but he was vetted by Travis. So it's not like this is a totally fresh coat of paint in terms of the executives. It's just it's a facade basically, and that's to be expected. I mean, you can't. This guy was one of the founders, Travis, and so for him not to have the say would be surprising. But in terms of how it was publicized, even the journalist coverage made it seem as though, well, maybe they're really turning over a new leaf with this guy. And certainly he's disowned Travis Kalanick, and the new rebrand that they brought out just earlier in September, it totally disowned not just the former management, which that's been going on for about a year. They've been saying that we don't want to associate with the previous image of Uber. But they also, in particular, were disowning the previous aesthetic and sensibility. And so that consisted of basically going from this very diverse set of colors to more minimalist color scheme with black, white, and what they call safety blue, which I guess they want to give off the impression that nothing bad's going to happen in your car, because tons of bad things have happened in Ubers. So in any case, it was both rebrands were very pandering, and I don't know. It's
pandering
an
to
interesting
what?
time. Yeah,
It basically there are political connotations here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Basically, to this, we're in definitely a difficult period of time where things are in flux, and you want to be accepted by everybody, and either you have to say we are for everybody, or we have a singular view. And so that came out in this narrative about local and global. So the first rebrand was about making Uber a local company, even though, of course, they're not a local company. They're this hegemonic sort of monopolistic company that's trying to take over everything and put taxis out of business and disrupt things, which, that's Silicon Valley ideology. But let's disguise that in 2016 so that people stop thinking about us that way. And then in 2018, though, the interesting thing is now we're a global company. You can trust us because we have this bureaucracy, and we're very formal. It's sort of high modernist sensibility now of control.
Okay. And so how do you come down in the end when your perspective on the book? Like, what's your judgment as a design critic?
Well, my judgment is not, certainly I think that it's unfortunate that, and I would recommend companies not make their brands into statements about geopolitics and corporate culture more broadly. I don't think they need to play into that. Somebody pointed out. There's a lot of good stuff to read in the book, and it's.
Sure. So you don't want to spoil your own plot?
No, apparently I've already spoiled it according to the chat. So, guess that's over. But
oh, really? Why? What did they say? I didn't see.
Oh, it's. I think they're joking. But okay. In any case, I lost my train of thought.
No, that's
you
okay.
had a question. Well, where do I come down on it? But yeah, you have something else.
Oh yeah, no, I'm just they were curious if you're even watching the chat, so now they know that you are.
Occasionally.
Don't let them distract you. Yeah, I know it's hard. So okay, interesting. So it must be an interesting time to be a writer who's paying attention to issues related to tech and these kind of insular commercial worlds, because I imagine if tech is anything like the niches that I'm maybe more familiar with, a lot of the journalists, the kind of official establishment journalists, often are quite cozy with the main players in the area, right? So a lot of, you have this problem in many domains, right, where a lot of the journalism is really kind of systematically not reporting some key observations that an educated observer who was less biased would be able to tell, very compelling stories about. So is that kind of like how you see your angle on these things, and why you're kind of, you're known for being, somewhat controversial, I think, on the internet, and you have a very kind of independent voice, I think you could say, doing things like writing these independent ebooks and stuff like that. Like, is this kind of how you see it? Like, you have to kind of go out on a limb as an independent person to kind of tell the truth about what's really going on in these insular worlds?
Yeah, I wouldn't say universally. There's certainly a lot of independent critics of tech, and I would say very much less so in design. There are many people who call themselves design critics, and I would say there's probably about somewhere between 25 and 50 who are genuinely critical, not from a just conventional perspective, where it's sort of like, oh, tech is alienating, or oh, we're spending too much time on our devices, or oh, disruption is a problem, or these are things, and they're important topics to discuss. But I think especially when it comes to aesthetics, I prioritize that, and that's something that everyone, I would say almost universally, thinks is very unimportant. And that's not, I would say, a problem of design critics per se. I think that's a problem of designers. Designers sort of want to repudiate aesthetics because, for multiple reasons. In particular, it means that there's no judgment. And so if you can say that aesthetics are unimportant, then when people are making their criticisms or judgments of a brand, you as the designer can kind of make this into this, make the brand into this totalizing thing where aesthetics are just one part of it, and you always have to emphasize that, rather than, wait a second, like, let's actually discuss what is going on here aesthetically, and why it came to be that way. So I guess going back to your question of sort of on whether people are biased or unbiased, whether journalists are getting the right story, I wouldn't necessarily blame journalists for that per se. They're not necessarily specialized in aesthetics, but I do think that there's much more room for exploring that. And in that sense, there was an interesting review by one of the major, I guess you could say, brand reviewers out there. He runs a website called Brand New. His name's Armin Witt, and he wrote some critical points about the brand, but it was also very celebratory, and it embraced the sort of propagandistic aspects of the rebrand in a sense, where he said, if they can follow through on actually being a good company, then this rebrand, which I think is basically boring and has nothing of interest, then it will be one of the most successful rebrands ever. And it's like, well, wait a second. You're basically saying that if they do all this other stuff that has nothing to do with design, then the design will be successful. So you're basically saying the design is totally vacuous, and you don't even need a design. They didn't need to do a redesign at all. They could have just skipped this whole charade. And I mean, maybe they could have. He could be right, but what does that say about design? And let's explore that. And why is this such a consistent view among designers?
Okay. Interesting. You just reminded me that I recently realized I came across somewhere, I forget where, probably maybe your website actually, that I did not know that you designed the icon for MailMate. I use MailMate.
Wait, really? Wow.
I didn't know that. I look at your icon every single day.
That's awesome.
That's cool. When did you do that for MailMate?
Oh, maybe 2014, if I'm remembering correctly.
Nice. That's cool. I'm just curious, if you don't mind me just picking your personal brain a little bit, what's like the biggest design job you've ever done?
Biggest design job. I mean,
or like anything else, or is there anything else like I would know of? I mean,
I've done a variety of things. I like to focus more on the criticism aspect. And certainly that's, I do design work. I've just released an icon for remote keypad. It lets you control your Mac with your phone. So say you're sitting on your bed, this is how I use it, and you want to type something on your computer. You can just, it's like a VNC type client, but it's got a little more control.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, I was just curious.
I work on a variety of things.
You're mostly do criticism. Sorry.
Well, it's not so much mostly. I think that in terms of, I think there's a strange sort of, I don't know if ad hominem type of dynamic that goes on where you have to justify your criticism by where you worked. So if you don't work at Facebook, Google, Apple, something like that, then who are you to say something? And as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I have worked for some big companies, and I do work on big name projects, but I actually am not interested in talking about that because I don't want to rest on some other name. I think that my arguments should stand on their own, and people can contest what I have to say, and maybe I'll be convinced by what they're saying. But I don't really care what company you work at, and I also don't want to make that part of my persona that, oh, like I'm the guy who works at X and Y company, or I've worked on this and that client. I'm not saying that like, oh, it's not important that I can make design of some quality, whether, you know, and that some people would certainly debate that. And that's fun. Like I'll entertain that, but I just don't, I don't know if that's necessarily part of what I want to put out there, that, oh, it's so important that I've done this and that.
Okay, yeah, sure. No, I hear that. I mean, it's strange that people would expect you to be in a company to be able to make good criticism of it. Like, I would expect the opposite, right? Like, I would imagine anyone who's worked for Facebook for several years is going to be like incapable of telling me really honest, valuable insights criticizing the design of Facebook, right?
Potentially. I mean, I think it really depends on the person and their capability of being critical. And so I think, you know, there's some insights that you can only get, right, by being inside a company. You know, maybe there was some crazy situation that happened with some executive, or maybe the manager did something that led to some result in the product in the end. But, you know, and those are insights that are valuable if somebody's willing to put that out.
Right.
Which is why I think, in particular, the Uber story is so unique, and I chose to write about it in such depth, because they actually basically spilled all the beans about all of the drama. And you know, apparently, this is something that didn't make it into the book, but I found out, and it's been corroborated by multiple people who worked at the company. But when Travis Kalanick revealed the first rebrand in 2016, he was apparently revealing the 12 or 14 values of the company, and he's wearing a lab coat. I mean, that's the kind of, no one knew why he was wearing a lab coat, but who knows? I mean, this is what happens in Silicon Valley, just random shit like that. But
yeah, that's weird.
point,
So is he like is it like performance art or something?
Maybe. I mean, I don't see that as him. Maybe he's trying to sort of justify it, and science, everybody likes science. So I can't say beyond that. But I mean, that's the type of thing you'll hear if you're in a company, and maybe that will make for a great story. But I think that we also should, as observers, trust our eyes, basically, and not you know, question our judgments. And I mean, we should question them in a sense after we make them, right? But we shouldn't immediately say, well, I don't have a say in this. I can't make up my own opinion on what is going on in the world. That's definitely my philosophy on that.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, how important do you think design is to the success of a big tech company?
It's interesting. I mean, design is so intertwined with the functioning of the product, just at a base level, that it's really hard to separate out, you know, what is purely design and what is, you know, something structural. And of course, there's 10,000 varieties of design, like, you know, system infrastructure. Someone could say, I'm designing the infrastructure of the servers, or, you know, all of this is, everything is design, so nothing is design. So in terms of breaking that out, maybe you're wondering how important is the aesthetic aspect, or how important is, I don't know if you want to clarify that.
Oh yeah, well no, you make a great point. Like I was initially thinking in a kind of naive way, like, does the choice of a logo, like if it's a good logo or a bad logo, is that going to make or break you know, the success of a tech company? But then obviously design is more general than that, and you think about, you know, like the user interface of an app. Like if it's total shit, it means the app, it doesn't work well, right? So there is no fine line between design and the hardcore functionality. So yeah, your point is well taken.
Well, you brought up something interesting there, which is, you know, you have an app like Craigslist, or it's not per se an app, but a website like Craigslist or Snapchat. And these are actually used by designers, sort of in that dynamic that I was describing earlier, where people discount aesthetics. They say, well, look at the success of these things. In fact, the inscrutability of Snapchat is exactly why teenagers like to use it. And actually, Snapchat wouldn't have been successful unless it had a horrible design as it did. And so we, you know, in fact, we should justify even building some more terrible designs, because look at their success. And it's like, this is total backwards post hoc rationalization. We can't, I mean, it's really hard to source what the success of Snapchat was. I'm sure the design had a major play in it, but I don't necessarily think it was because it was badly designed. And even from that perspective, I don't know whether Snapchat was intentionally designed in a bad way. And so if they did it by accident, maybe we could systematize that and turn that into a formula. But then it would cease to be bad design. It would just be designing well using this pattern that has then been established, and that would be like an interface pattern that we could go and make something based on that. But I think there's this sense. I don't know if this answers your original question per se, but same thing with Craigslist, right? Like, oh, it's ugly, it's quote unquote brutalist. That's what a lot of people are referring to it nowadays in the design world. It works, so sure. So does that mean aesthetics don't matter, or does that mean that people will tolerate things that are aesthetically unpleasing? Or these are all questions, but I don't think the immediate sort of conclusion we should come to is design doesn't matter or aesthetics don't matter.
Right. Well, I think one thing that is very clear to a lot of people is that the design choices of big tech companies, they seem very propagandistic. Is that fair to say? I mean, you basically alluded to it with Uber. There's very kind of obvious, they're trying to humanize themselves politically is often the intention, it seems. And I think you find this across the tech companies, right? Google, very infamously, right? The whole "don't be evil," this very generic kind of rainbow, logo of the word Google.
Well, they've actually just, I don't mean to interrupt, but they've actually just removed the "don't be evil" clause. So that's not part of their, they don't do that anymore. They're evil now.
But did they have like a big party at Google with champagne and everything? Like, be evil now, go for it.
I hope so. And it was probably at Burning Man, if anything, because I know that like Eric Schmidt likes to go down there and party. So if they're gonna start being evil, at least make a blast of it, like you're saying.
Yeah, they should say "be evil." That should be the slogan. But is this your view? Do you see like a lot? Do you basically see the kind of very humanistic, friendly design choices that appear throughout Silicon Valley? Do you see it as basically a kind of having a kind of propagandistic function?
I mean, definitely. In terms of, I think that all companies, whether it's through design or through tone of voice or messaging that isn't necessarily, maybe it could be audible, an ad on a podcast or radio show, something like that. All of these things are built with intention, and certainly no company or very few companies want to have a negative public perception. So I wouldn't even necessarily hold them like that against them. I mean, that's part of the role of design, is to put your best foot forward. That's an important role, and it's not bad that exists. So yeah, I guess I have a more mixed view on it. I don't necessarily think it's bad. I think that I'm also not saying that they should be like authentic or something and more true to themselves. They definitely, as far as I'm concerned, shouldn't pretend to be something totally not what they are. I mean, and this, I don't want to bring it back to Uber, but it's fresh in my mind right now that in part of the redesign, they kept saying, we don't want to be associated with automobiles and cars and all of these things. It's like, wait a second, you transport people, you're a transportation company. You don't have to, you can make yourself look great and put forward your best foot forward, but you don't have to say that you're not what you are. That's not necessary.
Right. Well, it's interesting because I think in the aftermath of things like the James Damore fiasco, a lot of educated people like look at tech and it's kind of clear what's going on, right? It's kind of clear that there is this really intense sort of political correctness. And without getting into the politics, like I don't want to bring you into any like big political debate. You don't have to comment on the politics if you don't want to. But it seems to me that it's increasingly kind of clear to people that big tech companies have this kind of strongly imposed and kind of enforced, kind of candy coated front, and anything that escapes that image is like brutally repressed or exercised. So yeah, I just wonder like how long is that going to last? Because I think people are kind of onto it. Like could you even imagine with the increasing political polarization in the U.S., like maybe soon there will be like kind of right-leaning companies that have a different aesthetic and a different design for like Trump's America. Like maybe they don't want the same type of branding. Like, maybe that's a good question for you. I'm curious. Is there any evidence of like polarization within the design world? Like some design groups or people or firms going in a certain direction and then another going in a different direction on politically polarized lines?
Potentially. I mean, I think designers are almost universally left-leaning, and maybe there are some designers that are more conservative, but I think that they would tend to be less vocal. And this is something that some design review places have pointed out. Like, why are all conservative websites? Why do they all have terrible typography? Or for instance, why is Donald Trump's hat, so ugly or something like that? The MAGA hats, and it's what is the Americana aspect of that, and people wanting to seem more approachable. I guess to answer your first question, will we see more polarization in the design world aesthetically along political lines? I wouldn't necessarily say so from Silicon Valley, that's for sure. There may be, I think there probably already exists. If you think of maybe a gun manufacturer, is probably going to have a different aesthetic than the Silicon Valley.
Boeing, right? Yeah.
But increasingly, we're all centralized online, and so where do things move in that nature? I don't know. What's coming? Yeah, I guess I would say things are going to stay pretty homogenous, and I don't necessarily think that's even political. I think that's more to do with artistic modernism going back for a century, 2 centuries. Like this is even. I'm sure there were people who ran giant corporations in the 30s or the 20s who had modernist aesthetics. Who were conservative, certainly by today's standards. So I think there is this sort of institutional aesthetic that is here to stay, basically.
Okay, interesting. There's a bunch of people in the chat are kind of joking about dopamine, and I wasn't even thinking about that, but it does kind of raise in my mind a possible comment or question, which is, I'm sure you follow this sort of meme, right? That a lot of people are aware of now, that interface designers are basically seen as kind of like evil, like dopamine hackers or manipulators. So does that ring true to you, like as a designer yourself and as a design critic? Are you like up all night reading like neurobiology textbooks trying to figure out how to make like brain worms?
That's definitely an area of study that there's the whole time well spent movement. I think it's there's a couple guys who run that, and they're doing interesting work. I think it's totally valid and important. We all do spend a ton of time in front of our computers and trying to get that dopamine hit. Totally get that. I certainly enjoy my dopamine hits, so I'm not leaving Twitter anytime soon. But I think that angle is covered in the tech world, and I also just don't think. My beat is, if I were to describe it that way, it tends to be much more along aesthetic lines than this sort of product ethics. And I have plenty of friends. My friend Kenneth Bowles, he just wrote a book about this, and so about design ethics and tech ethics. So I really would say that's important, an important area of study, but I think that it's definitely covered, and so I haven't really delved too deeply into it.
Okay, yeah, so you're more into aesthetics than those other things. What's your I'm just kind of curious. I'll just kind of ask you random questions. Also, you can ask me anything you want at any time.
All right.
This is our first time talking, so feel free to, change the gears of the conversation at any time. But what do you think is the most aesthetically successful or effective company in the world?
Oh, we're in tough times for me.
Yeah.
Because I'm very much an advocate of dimensional design, what I refer to it as. And basically, I don't know if you remember, but several years ago, what was your first smartphone? I guess we'll put it that way.
My first smartphone would have been the iPhone. I don't even remember what number, like the one that looked kind of like an iPod.
Okay. Do you remember how it had these sort of icons that maybe had leather, or they had all kinds of different materials and textures on them?
I think I vaguely remember that. It was like, yeah, I think so.
Okay. And I guess when there was this transition around 2013 where everything started to look really white and flat, do you remember that transition at all?
I remember when the icons went from having depth to being totally flat. I remember that. That was not that long ago. Is that what you're referring to?
Yep, exactly. What did you think of that?
I didn't think too much of it. I adjusted very quickly. I didn't really care too much one way or the other. I guess in my mind, it was like, you know, every time you get a new update or a new phone or whatever, the speed improves. So I think because it was correlated with the speed improvement, my emotions kind of felt positive about everything, you know? So I think, you know, it's not a cleanly controlled experiment, basically. So I remember not caring that much, but vaguely liking it. But I was probably, you know, misdiagnosing what I was liking. Was probably just the speed.
Well, that was deliberate. You know, I know you're being charitable, or maybe not, but you're sort of putting in all the variables, and that's definitely I appreciate that. But yeah, that was deliberate on their part to
Well,
sort
go
of.
on. So what was the idea, or what was intended?
Oh, so I mean, well, it was an interesting political, and this is
Yeah,
where
break it down for me.
politics
Take your
come
time.
into.
I want to
Sure,
know.
sure. Yeah, yeah. So I think there's so many different layers of politics, and there's sort of you know red and blue politics, and then there's politics within companies, and then there's politics within the design world proper, which don't necessarily map onto you know the conventional political debates you see in Washington or something along those lines.
Sure.
And so within the design world, you have this you know century plus of modernism, which infuses everything. I mean, I've been a massive critic of modernism pretty much since I started being conscious of design as a field of study beyond just sort of something superficial, and not in a negative sense. I'm not saying that to be like superficiality doesn't matter, but where I was purely looking at on the surface, which is what I still do. But there's a political lens that leads to varieties of aesthetics, and so what happened really was, you know, people like to think that design is very democratic, and if we all just decide collectively to move to a particular way of doing things, then that's how it's going to be done. But there are major patrons behind pretty much any design initiative, and so when people start moving to a particular type of typography or a particular type of rendering style within icons or within user interfaces, these things happen basically through mimesis, but also like one set of executives copying another set of executives. But it really comes down to some big power player, you know. And it used to be Steve Jobs was the source of a lot of aesthetic. He was the source of things proliferating out. But somewhere along maybe 2008 to 2010, things started moving in this more flat, traditionally modernist aesthetic, a graphic design aesthetic where you have big flat planes of color. And we had this moment around 2011, 2012, where things could have gone in two different directions. They could have maintained this trajectory that they had, where everything had depth, as you pointed out, with the old iOS versus the new one. And then they could have gone in the direction that Windows went with their design system was called Metro. And if you look at Windows 8, Windows 10, you have these giant block colors with the tiles that all have their own colors, sort of like a Mondrian. And basically, within Apple, there was this sort of internal coup against people who first of all, Steve Jobs died. And then the people who had his sensibility were removed forcibly. And Johnny Ive prevailed in that sort of fight. And so that's why we ended up with the aesthetic that we have today. And essentially,
wow, that sounds dark, man. You said that his the Steve Jobs acolytes were forcibly removed. Sounds like
yeah.
internal concentration camps you're suggesting. I'm gonna have to make another video about this.
It's hard to say. A lot. It's been kept under the rug. No,
we don't know. We don't know.
don't think so.
More research is needed.
Well, I've got a lot of research and perhaps a book about that at some point.
And so that was the modernist winning.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
So if that's modernism in your design sense, so what would you call Steve Jobs, or like the anti-modern or pre-modern? Like, what would you call that?
Well, I mean, some people call it Baroque. I don't really subscribe to that because I think it has different associations that it's not necessarily what it was. But basically, I wouldn't even say Steve Jobs was a modernist. I'm a modernist. We're all modernists. We can't escape modernism. Modernity is here to stay, and there's no going back.
But you could call the icon design before the flatness. Some people call that Baroque. That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Like digital
I mean,
Baroque.
Yeah, I mean, because there were a lot of materials like leather or um, what else? What else? Just textures in general. But there's this interesting thing within this debate between flatness and dimension where people sort of miss the essential point of what are we working with? We're working with these mediums or media essentially, and we can represent anything on a screen. And so we could represent a metaphor of a paper, a piece of paper. And so that's like a huge part of the web is the page metaphor. But at the same time, and there are people who even from the beginning of HTML and things early on were critical of the page metaphor and thought it was too restrictive. That we should branch off beyond that. I think Xanadu was one proposal that didn't really make any didn't get fully built, but essentially, we went down a particular path, and metaphors were always part of it. And the question is, how do you want to render those metaphors? You can render them as being very flat, or you can render them dimensionally. But ultimately, digital design is somewhere in between a graphic design project, like poster design or anything of that nature, and then it's directly between graphic design and industrial design. And that's things like, have you heard of affordance theory?
No.
So essentially, an affordance is this is the classic Don Norman example. You have a door handle and you want to open it up. And so a door handle should have some sort of visible sign or signifier of what its interactive possibility is. And the interactive possibility is what's called an affordance. So you could have a door handle with a totally functional affordance. It opens the door. But if you don't know how to turn it, or it doesn't even look visibly like something you could turn, then it's not really useful. And so it's the signifier that really is how you could judge whether a door handle is effective. And so what I think has been lost in the move from dimensional to flat design is this interest in caring about whether we can communicate things with users, and that would be involving metaphors that are sort of available visually to tell what they do.
Yeah, it's also kind of funny to think about it in relation to the spread of and the development of virtual reality technology. Like it seems like I wouldn't bet a lot of money on flatness right now. Like the flatness is probably not going to be the interest quite soon, right? I mean, once designers go into VR, once everything's VR, or maybe you don't think everything's going to be VR.
Oh no, and it's really perceptive that you brought that up. I mean, I think it's certainly been part of the conversation. How are things going to change with VR? But I think people aren't sure how to think about it because they've been in a certain mindset. It's inevitable that VR will bring dimensional objects, and that's no question. The question is, how do designers transition to that when they've been saying for the past 5 years that everything should be flat?
Right.
Well, why are you now justifying that things should be dimensional? I mean, there's no actual coherent reason for it. So we're just going to ignore that we spent the past 5-10 years talking about flatness being important, and just we never said that. Don't worry about that.
Yeah, right. So I unless I'm mistaken, unless I missed it, I think it was probably an accident, I'm sure, but I think you dodged my question of the most aesthetically successful company you can think of. Like, what's your favorite?
I'm not sure I dodged it, but I think the answer I was giving, and maybe I didn't elaborate on enough, was that I don't really think, certainly to my taste, they're companies that do things that I think are beautiful. Whether I agree with their overall sensibility, I wouldn't say I agree with many. Stripe is a company that is pretty successful visually. They have some of the most talented designers who care about the most minute details, but I wouldn't say that they're not also just riding on trends, which, I also don't want to disown trends. I think there's sort of a lot of epithets in the design world where people want to dismiss things, and it's like trends can be good or they can be bad. Like trends aren't bad per se.
But Stripe
so I don't want to be part of that. But
I could see that. The Stripe is very sleek. It's very simple,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm sure this is like a cliche in the design world. Like I have no sophisticated design thoughts or anything, but I could see a lot of insight in the idea that the best design probably just gets out of the way, right? I mean, I'm sure there are moments of momentous innovation where some sort of design idea really kind of pushes the envelope and, makes a major advance that's important. But second best probably is just being almost unnoticeable, right? The getting out of the way as much as possible. Like Stripe kind of feels like that to me. I've used Stripe for a few different things. I've paid using it, and I've also I help like some people run businesses and stuff, and so I've like set up Stripe payment interfaces and stuff like that. And it's just very simple. It's very elegant, and so I agree with you. I feel like my unsophisticated design judgment. I think Stripe is a good one.
Well, I really think you're entitled to your opinion, and I wouldn't discount it at all. Like it's not an unsophisticated opinion. It's just,
Yeah.
It's total. I think that we need to trust our judgments more. So I really would not put yourself down
That's
before
right. You did say
make a
that. So now I'm
critical
going to
judgment.
trust my judgments, and then
Yes,
the next 30 minutes is just going to be me ranting at you the truth of like design judgments.
do
Uh,
it. That would be awesome. I want to hear more of that.
I feel like with Stripe, it's really important, especially if like you're doing payment processing. I imagine you have to, do A/B test the shit out of your design choices, right? Because trust is so important, right? And I feel like when you go to pay someone through a Stripe interface, there is something about it that just looks very professional. It makes you feel like this person is not going to mess up my money. This person's not
Yep.
going to rip me off. This little box for my debit card information, it's just, it's going to work. I can just feel it, and it's going to be good.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
they do kind of get that. I wonder, it's got to be A/B tested. They A/B test the shit out of that sort of thing, don't they? Do they, or what do you know about that?
I can't speak to Stripe per se,
But
but
in
certainly a lot
general,
of companies do. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's definitely a phenomenon of people A/B testing. It's definitely a valid thing to do. I would say that though, data can be fetishized, and designing to data like, oh, our design is good because it matched the results that we wanted in our A/B test. Well, I mean, you also have to set a certain criteria, a set of criteria. And if you take away the judgment to make that criteria comprehensive, then you could succeed in capturing your data without actually being successful in the design. I think there's a certain amount
yeah.
of criticality needed to be able to use those effectively.
So what's your
Oh, go ahead.
go on? Sorry.
Go ahead. I'll remember.
Oh yeah, sure. I was gonna say what's the most badly designed company you can think of out right now?
It's tough. I think there's actually a lot of companies that deliberately try to be ugly, and so I don't want to name any of those, because I'm
And
just giving them what they want, right?
so they try to be ugly because they're trying to signal something else.
Yeah, well, there's a sort of ladder of sophistication in design where, if you make something beautiful, that's really naive. What kind of amateur are you that you actually
Right.
think things should be beautiful? Here I am, elevated above everybody else. I've been there, I've done that, and I can actually convince a team of business people that we should do something ugly. And sort of this cult of personality thing where, it's not even about it's sort of I don't know if it's auteur theory, but like one cliche is the whole designer as author. And if you can be this person with authorship in the world, then we have to elevate you as some sort of paragon of virtue. When really you're just producing ugly things, and you're proud of
Yeah.
that.
You see that in academia for sure. Like
Oh, really?
some of the best academics, their websites are utter shit. It's just like it's like one HTML page that they made in like 1994 or something like that, and
Yep. Yep.
it's just one page, and like each of their publications is just like one line with that like bright blue default like link color.
Mhm.
But that evokes authority, and that evokes seriousness, like when you're so kind of confident in your research stature that you don't need no fancy bells and whistles. You don't got to look beautiful. The power of your accomplishments speaks for itself.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say so that's called Professor Doctor style,
Oh yeah.
and there was an essay that was written about that.
Oh
But
nice.
I mean, that gets to sort of what people are calling brutalism, where it's about these raw materials. I mean, uh, in web design, I think there's sort of some contrast between architectural brutalism and web brutalism, which is a very sort of weak connotation, but there's some connection there. I guess I wouldn't put those in the same category, Professor Doctor style and companies like Dropbox that are deliberately doing these hand-drawn sort of messy stick figures, sort of nonsense, incoherence. I wouldn't put those in the same category, even though a lot of the techniques might be the same, and in fact, they may use the same fonts, or they may use, the default blue. Sometimes the intention matters, and you can tell that the difference. When it comes to the Professor Doctor style, I'm not even against it, because it has some appeal from the level of, these are the origins of the internet, right? And the internet came out of academia. So if you were around back then that kind of shows this is somebody senior. This is somebody who was maybe not entrepreneurial, but enterprising early on, and wanted to get on these early pipes and put their name out there, which is kind of cool. The question is, if you just started being, you just finished being a grad student, maybe you just got tenure, whatever it might be, and you have a Professor Doctor style, and it's total put on, and you built it in some conventional CMS today, or in your static site generator or something. Let's be honest here. What you're doing is totally, this is not real.
Well, you're saying that there's a kind of faux Professor Doctor style?
Oh, I don't know. I was saying if somebody were to do that, maybe there is.
Well, because I feel like you sometimes see that with like Jekyll sites, like some people who do like kind of nice Jekyll sites. So that signals they're like pretty good, they're hackers, that shows they're a hacker. But then it's really minimalist, kind of very simplistic, Dr. Professor style, arguably. So it's a kind of like affecting a kind of like brute simplicity. But in fact, like they put a lot of work into making this like posh little setup.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely a thing. I don't know. I guess I would have to ask those people if they were intending to do it in the vein of Professor Doctor style, or if they were intending to do it from the quote unquote web brutalism aesthetic, where which is a trend basically lately. And it's not to say that Professor Doctor, somebody just said, "What are those things in my ears?" All right, I'm not going to entertain that, but.
No, I should have. I actually wanted to say something. There's one person in the chat who's just being a total ass, and I'm very sorry about that. There's always like one person who's constantly talking shit at me, and you just got to learn to like disregard it.
Oh, totally. I mean, it's hilarious, so I don't mind it.
Good.
Yeah. No, I'm sure these are all great people.
But that is definitely some of them are not, for sure.
Oh, okay.
But that's exactly what they want to do. They want to basically troll over and over again until they say something that makes one of us slip up, and then like that's their victory for the night. That's all they've accomplished in the past 24 hours. But it happens to me too, man. Like there's always people who come to my live streams repeatedly to like talk shit at me, and it's like, dude, you come here all the time. Like you love me. Let's be honest. Anyway, just sorry about that. Just learn to ignore it.
No, I totally get what you're saying, and so far it's just been laughs. So if they're getting a win by me laughing, that's everybody wins there. So
cool. I just don't want you to take it personally. They do it to me too.
Not at all. Yeah.
Go on.
Maybe I don't want to take total control here, but
go for it, man.
There was something interesting that you brought up, and I'm not saying this to sort of be like, oh, well, you're totally uninformed by this, but you actually said something that a lot of designers say. You said Stripe was very simple, and it got out of the way. And I think that the fact that these are it's not an accident that this is the language that you would know about design. It's not MailChimp's design. I mean, basically the same thing as Dropbox.
We'll get to that after.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So. It's not an accident that you think about. I'm just going to minimize this. All right. So these are sort of cliches and shibboleths within design about things getting out of the way. And this gets back to that question of modernism. The entire language of modernism, reducing things to their essence, getting out of the way, design is the best design is the least design. All of these sorts of things. You know, it's a strategy, right? So you can add things and make things better. Like, well, you start with nothing, so you have a canvas. Maybe you don't even have a canvas. You have to add your canvas. But then you can also you can throw a bunch of stuff on there. That's addition. You can take stuff away. That's subtraction. But these are just strategies that anybody can pursue. And what we've done is to fetishize the subtraction. And of course, anybody can add, and you have to know what to take away in order to. Well, anybody could take away either. I mean, it's. I think that there's this sort of mistake of basically taking on just one aspect and then universalizing it. And it's important to some extent to have some totalizing philosophy in order to get anything done. So if you want to get people to cooperate, and design is a very institutionally backed thing where you have teams and teams, hundreds of people working to build something, you have to have some through line that keeps them all on the same path. But the problem is that we've had over a century of people taking these cliches and turning them into basically a religion. And so that is the language of design now. You can't, even though I'm critical of these things, I still go in and I'm like, well, is this too much? Am I really getting in the way? And then I think, wait, am I really getting in the way? Does it matter? Maybe I should be adding more here. And basically, though, it was interesting that you said that Stripe was good because of these things. It's probably partially good because of those things, and then it's also good because they added some other decorative elements that we can appreciate as well.
True. That's a really good point thinking about it. I just think about like payment processing in particular. Like a lot of checkout forms are very busy and there's a lot of stuff going on. Like in a certain type of checkout form that was the style for a little while. Like especially like the ones that are on the page. They're often kind of busy, and I feel like busyness is sometimes associated with like mistrust. I feel like,
Totally.
like a spam email, like this dude from like Nigeria who's constantly hitting me up for money. His emails are always like there's a lot going on. There's like more text than you need. There's more stuff going on than you need. It does not inspire confidence. But like when you do a Stripe payment and like that little light blue box pops up, it's like nothing but the payment box. It's all clear around the edges. You're just like, this is where my money belongs. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's very effective. I guess it would come down to, say, for instance, someone were to argue that there shouldn't be a checkbox icon so I believe, and I don't know if this is the older design, but once you hit the submit or the pay money button, it would do a little loader and then it would give you like a check icon. And somebody out there could say, well, don't use an icon, use text, or these sorts of arguments. You're decorating too much, right? Sometimes the decorative elements are actually the necessary things to inspire the same confidence that you're referring to. I'm not saying that we should also go back to this traditional terrible form design where you have people asking you, everything from your social security number to like your daughter's first name or whatever it might be. Like that's not necessary. You're trying to buy, your groceries or whatever you're trying to get, takeout, but you don't need that. But there's some balance of judgment there.
Right. Do you want to take the MailChimp question? We had a super chat from Brian Knuckles for $2. Wants to know about or I'm sorry, what was it? He said MailChimp. What do you think about MailChimp's new design?
Sure. And you may want to just address. Oh, okay. You were just in front, but your mic's good. It was a little bit off.
Oh yeah, it's because I sat up.
Yeah. Now you're good. Okay. Cool. So MailChimp's design. I think I'm trying to remember who was by. I should know this. Collins, that's who it was. So it's this, and it wasn't just Collins, I believe. But in any case, Collins, basically, they were most famous recently for doing, earlier on, they did Airbnb. They did a campaign for them of these sort of very strange characters, something that you might see out of MTV, just very weird sort of urban hipstery illustration style. But then the big one was, I believe it was sometime in 2017 that they came out with the Dropbox redesign. and that was a mess. I think I may have touched on this a little bit earlier, but it had some of the brutalist aesthetic aspect to it, where it was trying deliberately to be ugly. The illustrations didn't really make any sense. It was in some ways referencing traditional media, so it might have had brush strokes or it might have had crayon type of stroke marks, but it basically was not particularly pleasing. That was a major deal because Dropbox had this very corporate aesthetic. So where Uber went from sort of a corporate universal aesthetic with all these different colors to a very minimal aesthetic, Dropbox went from a very minimal aesthetic to this super elaborate, expressive style that basically was also incoherent, but didn't really. All right. So in any case, so that's Dropbox. And then we have MailChimp. And MailChimp, they have their same logo, which goes back to John Hicks. And then they have this new typeface, I believe it's called Cooper or something or other. In any case, I don't really, I mean, I think it's the same judgment of Dropbox. So.
Right. Okay. Oh, so you see a similar pattern as with Dropbox, and you judge that kind of negatively. I think you called it used negative words to describe it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I think it's just trying too hard. And also, if everyone is doing this thing to be original, then it ceases to have that function. And maybe if one person did it, but these things get commodified, and so if they don't have something compelling of their own, then they just start following a trend, and it stops having much effectiveness.
Okay, right. All right. Well, there you have it, Brian. There's your expert judgment of MailChimp. I mean, how is it that, because you basically are, you're quite critical, at least in our conversation so far. Most of the design efforts that we've talked about, you've been kind of negative about, I'd say. Like, how is it possible that such big companies with such large sums of money can botch the job so much? Like that's actually a good question. Like, surely they test all of this stuff. Surely they have, they know how to A/B test the shit out of everything. Like, you would think that it would be less common for there to be like big design snafus.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of characters involved in any redesign, and there's internal politics in a company, people who are trying to make their mark, external agencies brought in to assuage people's worries, and so there's so many factors that can go into this that it's less surprising than you might think why you might get a strange result. That said, I think most people's intentions are to do something that they're proud of. There certainly are people who go out and deliberately try to make a mockery of the company that they're working at because they're maybe a little bit nihilistic about design or disillusioned, and sometimes rightfully so. Like maybe they've had seen some of the depths of horrible circumstances at design companies, but I personally don't think that the icon or the logo is the place for taking that out. But yeah, there's a lot of reasons why people might end up with, and sometimes it's just by accident. Things start going on a trajectory, and you've got a certain amount of time, and you have to ship something. So that's how it goes.
Right. Are you tired, by the way? How much time do you have? A few more questions, or how you feeling?
Go for it. Yeah, I'm good.
Cool. Someone actually suggested this earlier in the chat, and it's actually a really good idea. I would love to invite you to critique my design for my internet presence, whatever part of it you see or have any kind of familiarity with. Give me like a brutally honest critique of my design choices, because mind you, as a kind of creative person on the internet, like all of the stuff I do on the internet autonomously, I've never hired a designer to do anything. So if you any sort of visual choices or any sort of design choices, I did do myself. So, and I don't know what I'm doing. So I would love an expert, some expert brutal honesty.
Well, we could maybe call it outsider design then.
Okay. Yeah, there you go.
All right. So pull up, give me a URL.
Oh, you want me to give you like specimens?
Well, I mean, I can't, I don't know what we're referring to, so I have to know what I'm looking at.
Okay. Yeah, let's do this then. I'll give you, Yeah. You know, because I have this hypothesis, like I think the reason why academics hate me so much is because my design is so hot.
Mm,
Remember we were
okay.
saying, you know, we were talking about how like there's the doctor professor style where you're supposed to be
Oh,
really
sure.
like plain and ugly. I think that my design choices are just so damn hot that that's why I'm getting all this pushback in academia, I think.
Yeah, that's
So,
definitely it.
so all right, let's do, how about we'll do my website, my personal, it's a Jekyll site, jmurphy.net one.
So how did that happen that you became technically inclined in your line of work?
I've always kind of just done stuff like I was making websites, like basic websites. I was never like a major computer nerd. Like I didn't get into like real proper coding early or anything like that. If I did, I'd probably be in Silicon Valley or something. But you know, I was making websites in high school, you know, just messing around with like HTML sites. And so I learned HTML and stuff like that from an early age. And then I've always stayed relatively with it. But and in my graduate training, I did a lot of statistical programming, statistical data analysis with like
Hmm.
the R language in particular. So I did actually get quite good with R and doing statistical analysis through coding. And then through that, I learned Python and I learned some other stuff. And then now I'm basically kind of able to like just find whatever I want to do. Like I find someone else who did it. I find the code on GitHub and then I just like copy it. I've
Right.
been able to get incredibly far in my life stealing code from GitHub. Like I have a Jekyll site. Like I never learned how to program in Ruby, but I figured out how to make Jekyll sites just by following other people's code.
That's
Okay,
awesome.
so here let's take a look at my personal kind of research academic website, whatever.
Cool.
Murphy.net. I will screen share it. Booyah. So that is the oh, can you see? So that is
Yeah.
that's the homepage. And I'll kind of move around. So it's got the latest blog post featured here. Then it's got, oh, by the way, I have this like Flux program that changes the, is that
It's
affecting?
not activated on the screen share, so
So
if it's on,
it shows you like the normal colors.
yeah, we can see the white, plain white.
So it's plain white, and then this is like teal, and this is purple. Or you seeing?
Through my side, it looks a little bit more blue, but
Yeah,
for
that's right. That's right. Okay, cool. So yeah. So okay, so front page. What do you think about that? How is this hitting you from a design perspective?
all right. Well, first, I just have a question. Is this something that is 100% custom, or was this something that you built based on anything that exists prior?
Yeah, it's a fork of a other someone else's Jekyll theme. Uh,
Okay.
but I kind of modified it myself. Yeah.
Hmm. So there's a few things going on here, and these are sort of philosophical choices about UI elements, right? Like, so there's this centered block of three columns, and I'm not sure what the relationship is of that to the navigation on the top.
Mm,
Um,
okay.
it's definitely effective at saying, what are my main pursuits, right?
Right.
Uh, I'm not sure, like in terms of a composition thing though, uh, I'm not sure what the relationship between those things are. Maybe
Right.
if you can
Probably
scroll down.
makes no sense.
Well, maybe. I mean, so that's a legitimate way of doing things, having the navigation be directly adjacent to the edge of the browser. Another option that you can do, given that there's this alignment between all of the different sections you have, the main hierarchy and the central element, the content, and you have the about the site section, and then you have the footer section. I mean, I guess the
Mhm.
about the site is also a footer of its own, but in essence, you have everything is aligned. All of the other sections are aligned vertically on that vertical line, and then the top navigation doesn't align to that. So it's just something that's a little bit off from the rest of the alignments. But that's one aspect I would notice
Okay.
immediately. Let's see. So I think that it definitely seems serious. It's not, you're not playing games here. this is intentionally. Let me just see, my battery's going to die eventually. So if we cut out, then that'll happen.
Okay, fair enough.
But yeah, you're saying this is not, a joke website.
And what
Yeah,
about like the design motifs? Like, are they out of fashion? Like, like this drop shadow on the header, is that like passe, or are there like little like passe things that I'm not aware of because I'm not hip.
Well, I mean, drop shadows are not in or not in. It's all about how you use them. Material design is very emphasizes drop shadows as one of the core motifs. It's not offensive how you're using it. I would say though that and this is something almost no one cares about these days, but as far as personally, I would say that there is an important aspect of having there be a color hierarchy. And so if you have that navigation bar and that's white, and then you have a white section below it, I mean, technically in the real world, it's possible that you could have something that's higher that has the exact same color, and in this case, brightness and hue as the lower element. But to create hierarchy, you can use multiple different elements like color or shadow or height, these sorts of things. And so if you were interested in having sort of maybe a grayer background for the main section or a color background for the header navigation, some other way of distinguishing it so there's not this sort of floating shadow between two planes that are somehow like simultaneously different levels and also the same level in terms of their visual quality, in terms of being the same color.
All right, man, that's good. I feel bad now. I'm like, it just occurred to me, am I exploiting you because I'm like using you as a consultant?
Yeah, this is going to cost money. This is I'm billing by the minute here, so.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I just realized I should have more respect for your expertise. That's cool though. That's good. That's how about real quick, can we also just look at my podcast, like, because that's like an actual like brand kind of that I've had to do totally off the cuff. So if you look at like like let's see, like my like let's see, yeah, look at this for instance. I've had to like choose colors and stuff like that, and I never really thought about it. So I've kind of gone with this like teal color and like yellow. So you see this kind of like throughout my brand, I guess you could call it. So if you look at like the Twitter, for instance, and also the YouTube and stuff like that, like honestly, probably at some point, if my stuff like keeps growing, I'll actually try to pay someone to do all of this like properly and make it all look nice and integrated. But
check those notifications. Hold on. Check the notifications.
I don't want to bother everyone with here. We could, I mean, I could, but who knows what we'll find there. I don't want to blow up anyone's.
All right, so yeah, I guess I'm curious, what was the thing behind, you've got hexagons and then you also have this sort of bit pattern of these squares. What was the idea behind that?
Honestly, the idea was really just the fact that I don't know anything about design and I'm not an artist. So I figured the best way I could like make an aesthetic is just to find some art in public domain and then some old art in the public domain and then use that art as like source textures basically. So this color, like this teal color that you're looking at, is from a Paul Klee painting from like the 1920s or something like that. So it's like public domain, and I just basically copy it and remix it for different purposes. I feel like that was like a risk-averse way to make sure I don't have like a painfully ugly kind of design or aesthetic. But maybe it is. I don't know. I have no idea.
Well, I haven't run across that painting, so can't say maybe it's like total ripoff, but definitely I think it's also not within the popular imagination enough that I would imagine most people would catch on to that.
Right. So yeah, I don't think many people would catch on to it. Oh, I don't mind about people knowing it. I'm shameless about like remixing culture, I guess.
Clearly,
but it's more like, does it work? Or if it doesn't, like what's bad and what might I, or how about, I mean, look, I'm not going to actually like exploit you for your consultancy. Maybe we'll wrap this little game up by, do you want to just tell me, like, when you look at those colors, when you look at that like image, what does it say to you?
Sure. I mean, so I think there's two aspects of it. There's the color, and that's definitely sort of some rich colors. They're not super saturated, but they do have they have some depth to them. Or I don't know what the right word is, but they're not trying to hide from you that they're there.
Okay.
And then when you match those deep blues with the typography, which, do you know what font that is? Is that like Futura or something? Or?
Shoot, I forget. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. It's something thick. I mean, it's with 2 C's. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely another serious brand. It's saying, this is maybe not an institution per se, but, we're going to be talking about serious topics here.
So for someone who doesn't know anything about art or design, it's not that bad.
I would say definitely not that bad.
Dude, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
What's that? I haven't been.
You didn't give me. I didn't have to stretch that hard, so works out.
Well, no, I appreciate it. If you're just being nice and anything later comes to you, you can be totally brutally honest with me. You can tell me, like, hey, that one thing about my design, it's ugly as frick, and I should remove it. Don't hesitate.
Well, I mean, I think so. Going back to, I think Other Life is a more developed brand, but the website, I would say, and it's a little bit tougher because web design has a bunch of different constraints that you have to factor in beyond. Well, I mean, it's all graphic elements, but it's interactive more than Other Life, which is, it's maybe an avatar, or it's a background, Twitter background, or it's an album art for your podcast. But those are more constrained exercises. And so with the website, you have to think about responsiveness so that it scales, and you have to think about, I would say, play a little bit with what you've got going on, those colors down in the footer area. Those could repeat somewhere in the upper part of the site.
Okay, right. We got some very sophisticated design critiques in the chat. One person thinks my designs are homosexual.
Okay.
Someone says they're very inconsistent. Someone says I should have links that say read less. Thank you, everyone. That's very, very helpful. I think, yeah, ever since I did a live stream with Kantbot, the IQ of the chat room of my live stream has decreased by like 15 points, I think.
Well, certainly not. Kantbot probably raised it with his own IQ, but then probably the trolling level has brought it down.
Yeah, maybe. So we're now, we're, I think, at like an hour and a half now, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't want to overtax you. I'm not in any rush to leave, but I also don't want to use anything else on your mind, or what are you thinking about nowadays?
What I think about nowadays.
We could play a little game where it'd be kind of fun. I could ask you some companies, and you could just give us, like, is it Eli's thumbs up or Eli's thumb down?
Sure.
In design terms, like, do you want to do that?
Sure.
So thumbs up just means you approve. Thumbs up means you disapprove, like on net. Okay, let's see. Netflix, the website, or the brand. And every time it'll just be like the brand and the overall brand and app or whatever. Netflix.
Okay. Can I do sideways? Thumb sideways?
Yeah, but you have to explain why.
Okay.
Well, or no, you can just do sideways, whatever you. I don't know.
No, sure. I mean, Netflix, they do a lot of interesting interactions. I don't know how many people have played with their mobile app, but they're definitely experimenting in cool ways with translucency. They have a lot of logos. I mean, they have a fun area to play with because, movies have amazing graphic design, and if you can use that in the UI, then that's a really great opportunity. But they haven't. It's also a giant job because if you have a graphic for a logo of a film, and then you want to scale it, you have to reproduce something that may never have made a digital asset and reproduce it. And so they've kind of taken a hacky job with it. But I would say if people want to check out some cool interaction, check out the mobile app for that.
Okay. How about Amazon?
Amazon. Oh man, well that's a company that is 100% A/B testing everything. And so I am not particularly a fan of their visual design, but you know, I'm sure that they are making hand over fist money. So
Right.
can I really argue with that? Yes, I can. I'm going to argue with that. But
Okay. Right. Yeah, your focus is kind of visual design. So we'll assume
yeah.
these questions are about the visual design in particular. Um, how about Microsoft? What's up with them?
Microsoft gets a lot of hate, and I think that I mean, I wouldn't say their products are necessarily going to be successful compared to Apple, just from lock-in. But they have, they brought about flat design in many ways. And not only that, today they're still pushing boundaries in ways that Google and Apple aren't. And I'm certainly not the biggest fan of Microsoft, and I don't even think they're going to realize their vision anytime soon because they've just have so much baggage and so much technical debt, and design debt. And they have to focus on, satisfying customers, this legacy customer base. So it takes a lot of time for them to bring any initiative about in a real way. But I think in terms of their experiments, they're doing a lot of cool stuff.
Okay. What about
Even if I
YouTube?
disagree with a lot of it, I think that it's at least more compelling than what most people are doing.
Okay. How about YouTube?
YouTube. I guess I would say that's part of the, go ahead.
It's pretty simple, I was saying, their design.
Yeah, well, it's all white, so I'm blinding myself right now. In terms of YouTube, it's part of the material design aesthetic, very pared down. I would say Gmail is a bit more pleasing to the eye than YouTube. Just maybe it was done later, but and there's still some problems with that. I mean, it's interesting because a few years ago, Google was very accepting of color. And they even said in one of the material design releases, they said, there's no such thing as a wrong color, which, I mean, sure, in theory, but whenever you're trying to make something, that's not the idea that you want to put in here, that you can just put anything here.
Right.
But in terms of now, they're moving totally away from using color, and all of their main brand is being totally white. So that's unfortunate.
How about the original MySpace?
User themed designs. What was before that even? MySpace was based on like GeoCity. There's some relationship between GeoCities and MySpace. I mean, I think it would be kind of cool if we saw a resurgence of that, even just because it would mean that there could be a new generation of people coming up who would get into design because of playing around as kids. And that's kind of, I think that's a very common
That's true.
Story of designers to have been into, say, kid pics or whatever it might be. But that's sort of not, I mean, at the same time, everything is kind of free. Everybody pirates Photoshop, so there is a huge amount of design literacy today. But there isn't that sort of playing around with your friends necessarily. Although, what do I know? I'm probably not young enough to be able to speak to that. But I don't see the same energy in UI design coming from young people. It seems like more UI designers come out of, oh, I want a job that's not like horrible and painful to do, and it also has a reliable income, even if it's not like massively lucrative. But it's not like working in a coffee shop, which I would not say working in a coffee shop is bad at all. Like, if you can make that work, that's awesome. Especially if they give you health insurance. Nothing wrong with that.
Definitely, for sure. Okay, that's it. I was just thinking about that. Like, yeah, how MySpace used to be so cool because you could design it yourself, basically.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I could
and
totally.
It was cool. Like, there was nothing wrong with that. No one was going to say, "Oh, your MySpace is bad." It was like, no, that's just an expression, and it's fine. People are playing around here.
Yeah, yeah. How about? I'm trying to think of a tough one. I don't know. I think I'm out of. I think my brain is starting to go slow.
Yeah, it's probably insanely late for you there.
Yeah, it's 12:24. It's not that bad actually. I've done some the past week. I did a one or two that was like at, started later than this one, so
Mm.
kind of used to it now. I'm kind of adapted. Was there anything you wanted to talk about other than what we've already covered?
Let me look to the chat and see if there's anything intriguing here. But I'm also a little bit.
Yeah,
out of
you're at work,
it.
right?
Not quite, but I came out of work here.
Oh, okay, yeah. Did I
Yeah,
ask you what do you do for what's your job right now? Your main job?
So I do UI design for a tech company. I don't really want to get into it too much, but
Oh yeah, you don't have to.
I work on apps, basically web apps. A lot to do with design systems. That's sort of a trend, I guess, in design is to do a lot with design systems. So
So
that's
is
the main
your
type of stuff.
okay? Is your current employment like private from your internet presence?
Not at all. I just
You
again, it
don't.
kind of goes back to that philosophy of wanting to have my arguments stand on their own.
Oh right, I hear you. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Right, right.
Because
Cool.
it's always been, I think, very early on in being a critic, people were saying, "Well, where have you worked? What, do you even know what happens in these mystical design studios where these things are breathed life into, and you can't say anything about that if you're just some uh, layman." And it's like, wait a second, no, laymen are awesome. There's actually this. This is very common. To sort of disparage the idea of the critical enterprise at all. And I don't know, this is actually something I wanted to get into. It, I think it was before we started the stream, but you were talking to the chat and you were talking about how you had been yelling at the world about how all the art in this gallery was terrible.
Oh yeah.
What was that all about?
Um, I don't know. I've just always had like a very like performative anti-authoritarian streak, I guess, and I guess wherever like institutions nurture or sustain kind of smug complacency, if I get near it, I just want to kind of fuck it up in ways that often get me in trouble and usually force me to kind of be ousted or to remove myself. But I like to kind of, I have a habit or a tendency in my own life to kind of get involved in certain institutional spaces and then I leave in a grand gesture of like attacking everyone.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, well, I think okay. So in the art world, I think it's a little bit different because so I make a long story short. I in Philadelphia in grad school, I lived in Philadelphia, and
Hmm.
I was like I lived in like a DIY music venue, and it was like a punk warehouse kind of art space, and so I was like socially embedded in the kind of like independent art scene. So like a lot of my
Mhm.
friends, did art in like the various galleries, the gallery scene in Philadelphia or whatever. And so I was like socially embedded in that. And I was a political science, I'm a political scientist. So I didn't have a horse in the race of the art world at all personally in terms of my career. But a lot of my friends kind of were trying to play like the art game, like wanting to be famous artists or whatever. And so they all the artists like they like to talk about like how radical and critical they are, and they're willing to say anything and do anything, and they're so badass, like anything goes kind of. They very much kind of like affect this kind of
Hmm.
like badass rebellious spirit, and
Mhm.
yeah, so that seemed to me like that makes it fair play to kind of like when people affect a certain type of badassness and they're not living up to it, then you know, I think it's fair play to call them out on. Yeah, I think it's fair play to call people out on shit. Look, I think in a
So,
lot of
well,
yeah, go
go
on.
ahead. Were they being, what was it that they were saying they were rebelling against? And then, I mean, maybe you don't want to get into it, but what were the, why did they see themselves as so rebellious? If, I mean, they're artists after all. So what were they rebelling against the studio culture, or like what was,
Well, all artists like today, like the institutionalized art world, they're all about like how they're criticizing capitalism and they're like
oh, of
trying
course,
to
yes.
they're subverting the power structures through their like conceptual poetry performances and stuff like that. That's like the dominant fashionable thing.
Right.
It's true. I mean, it's a similar thing in academia, right? Like the kind of fashionable, cool thing to be in academia is like, you're speaking truth to power. You're, criticizing capitalism and the power structure. And you see this in a lot of the liberal professions today. And it's really hypocritical. I mean, it's all totally bullshit performance, right? I mean, it's not even profound to say that. I think it's quite a banal point almost to make. But if you're actually in those worlds and you want to like, you can't just like say, hey, this is hypocritical. You guys are not being honest about, what you're affecting. You can't just say that, like then it has no effect. But if you kind of like enter the world and then you gain some capital within the world, and then you do some sort of like grand gesture where you basically kind of like sacrifice your standing in the group to like attack the group's own hypocrisy, that can have like a lot of effect. And it's fun too.
Did it have that effect?
Yeah, I think I single-handedly helped the entire art world see their hypocrisy, and I think I transformed. I think I no, but I mean I definitely had an impact on that local art scene for like at least some amount of time.
What do you think changed afterwards?
I think probably like some of the younger people who were like more honest and genuinely radical maybe kind of saw it, and then they were like, yeah, I'm gonna not do this like gallery shit. I'm gonna go do something like radical on the internet. Maybe. I mean, I don't know. That's always my hope. Like, I feel like, I mean, I'm not on some kind of like political activist mission with any of my, performative with any of the performative aspects of what I do. But I do think that there's often a positive political byproduct. I don't know how big it is, but I think what it is there is an empirical model where like the model is this: gain cultural capital within a particular milieu, and then with that cultural capital, spend it or burn it in a grand gesture of calling bullshit on that milieu's internal dishonesties. Like that works. It both works to kind of get a point across, and two, it works to kind of, you have to accept that you're no longer ever going to live or work in that milieu, but then you can like go on to do something else.
I think there's something unfortunate about that I don't think is necessarily the case.
Okay, sure.
So I would hope for you and for all of us who care about being honest, that we can, and this is totally, not necessarily totally, but it's potentially naive that you can actually speak your mind in the world and not be committing career suicide. But I guess there's always risks, and oh fuck, we lost it.
Are you dying? Oh, we lost Eli. Dude, that was pretty epic how it cut out right when he was about to give us his grand theoretical reflections on how to subvert institutions. I think there might be someone, trying to shut him up. I don't know what happened just there. Could have been the deep state. Could have been Steve Jobs. Oh, here we go.
We still good?
We got you back. Yep.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I gotta peel this thing off. All right. So yeah, I think there's definitely room for not just totally slash and burn everything on the way out. I think ideally you just keep doing what you're doing, right? Unless in this case of this artist commune or whatever it was, maybe you didn't want anything to do with them anymore. So good riddance. But yeah, like ideally you just keep speaking what you have to say.
No, you're definitely right. That's one possible outcome that is often quite good is, you say what you need to say and maybe it makes a bit of a fuss, but you just carry on and you keep working within that tradition, within that community, and people just have to deal with what you think. And you have the disagreeability and strength of mind to just let it hang out there and roll with it. I would say that I think there are different strategies. There are multiple cultural strategies, and I think different strategies suit different people depending on their strengths and weaknesses. So some people are better at keeping their mouths shut than other people. Some people like me are kind of like constitutionally incapable of keeping their mouths shut like beyond a certain amount of time about certain things. And also different people have different goals and values, and depending on your strengths and weaknesses and what you personally want to get out of life. And I genuinely think that that can be different for different people and should be different for different people. There are definitely lots of cultural strategies. So I definitely never want to make it anything I say sound like, I think there's like only one proper way of comporting oneself in the public culture. But my role model is someone like Diogenes. I don't know if if you're familiar with the kind of ancient cynicism. Someone like
You can
Diogenes.
elaborate on it.
What's that?
Go ahead, please elaborate on it.
Yeah, sure. So one of my role models is Diogenes, also known as Diogenes of Sinope. And he was an ancient cynic, and cynicism in the ancient sense means something very different than what it means today. So it's a very confusing kind of history. So best to kind of just bracket what you think cynicism means. But basically, Diogenes, his cultural strategy was to accept a life of poverty and social ostracism, and basically speak truth to power on a daily basis in kind of the most ridiculously over the top and unreasonable ways, so that basically he couldn't be ignored, and so he was known for doing lots of, he was basically a performance artist. He was like one of the first Western modern examples of a performance artist in some sense. He was known for like going around and actively doing things like barking like a dog at people. And he was a bit of a philosopher. Like he didn't write that much, but he did leave behind some reflections on the larger cultural politics of what he was doing. But it's basically, it's kind of a little bit similar to someone like Socrates, in the sense that just Socrates is someone that people, have some idea of from like their undergraduate days. Not a lot of people learn about Diogenes in their undergraduate days, but just like Socrates kind of went around asking people questions that were very awkward and got a lot of people upset with him because he was an annoying gadfly. Diogenes was kind of similar, but like way more aggressive, and yeah, and Alexander was a famous little anecdote is that Alexander the Great said that if he could not be Alexander the Great, he would be Diogenes. And so the idea being that there is a kind of profound, there is a certain type of pathway. There's a strategic pathway. It's unique and it's specific and it's quite difficult. It's certainly risky, and it brings a lot of stresses and difficulties that maybe other people wouldn't want in their life. But it does have a kind of well demonstrated kind of empirical mechanism to it in terms of the larger cultural power and effects that it can have, where you basically take it upon yourself to perform certain truths, or call people out on their bullshit in certain purposefully over the top ways that gets you a lot of flack, but for that reason actually sort of has real effects on the culture that people can't just dismiss. He was famous for a phrase. There's a certain phrase Foucault writes about it. Foucault has a really nice book called Courage of Truth, one of his last lecture series, where he talks a lot about the logic of Diogenes. Really, really good book. And one of Diogenes's phrases or slogans for this like cultural political strategy of ancient cynicism is, quote unquote, deface the currency. That the idea is that by kind of performing certain cultural tropes in a certain kind of over the top way, you end up kind of decreasing the value of false coins. You kind of reveal false coins to be what they are, and you actively make the false coin worth less by performing certain things in an over the top way. And that kind of idea or slogan of defacing the currency has been something that I've always been just naturally suited to. It's just something that I it's partially that I have certain personality traits that just incline me to live in a certain way, and it's hard for me to do otherwise. But then also over the years, like ever since I started reading political theory in grad school, I have been thinking about this quite consciously, and through people like Diogenes, I have developed quite an explicit kind of political theoretical understanding of these shenanigans that I'm involved in. So I don't want to make myself sound too calculated, but I do, I have been thinking for a long time about my role in the larger public culture and the games that I would choose to play.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's certainly been conversations that wouldn't have happened otherwise, without participation that you've been giving. And I think, just going off what you're saying, there's an aspect of, building up to a preference cascade. Now, whether or not you're going to be alive by the time the preference cascade happens, we'll see. But there's an important aspect of, unmasking things and, you could say even deconstructing them. But anyway,
That's right.
There's, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure whether or not you're calculating about it or not. There's certainly some depth to the philosophy behind it. And then, as you said, there's an aspect of sort of characterological traits that lead you to want to pursue that. And then there's just, you wake up and you say, and this may be just elaborating on that, but you wake up and you say, well, this is something that I care about talking about today. And then somehow by the next day, maybe you're still talking about it, maybe you're not, but it's also somewhat spontaneous as well. In many cases.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's really important that people, at least some people, really cling very tightly to that freedom, to be something different each day. It often looks weird, and sometimes even looks stupid, and it should look stupid. Like, the people should have a right to be stupid. I mean, it's a very important right. Like, even for the smartest people, it's hard to be really, really smart. It's hard to find the smartest things you're possibly capable of saying or doing without sometimes letting yourself be the stupidest version of yourself that you are. I think we have an epidemic of that. I think we have an epidemic right now where lots of really smart people, and lots of them, I'm not special at all, thousands and thousands of quite smart people, they're not actually allowing themselves to find the smartest and most significant things that they're capable of saying or doing. And that's in large part because they're so risk averse on minimizing the mistakes that they make, basically.
Right.
Because mistakes are punished really, really strongly, both morally, but also just in a non-moral sense. A lot of people have it in their minds that, like, they're going to be judged by, like, the dumbest thing that they ever do. But first of all, that's wrong. Like, internet culture fundamentally works in a totally different way. And this is something a lot of people, especially academics, don't understand. And I've really been kind of thumping my drum about this because I was talking about this with Robert Mariani just the other night. We had a nice chat about it. Like, one of the coolest things about the internet that academics and a lot of prestige figures don't understand is that generally you do not get punished for the mistakes and shitty, crappy things that you do. The punishment for all the crap stuff you do is that it gets ignored. Generally, that's the worst that happens. In some cases, yeah, you might say something really bad and it goes viral and you get a lot of flack for it. But those are a relatively small number of cases. Even in those cases, to be frank, the media news cycle is so rapid that even those go away fairly quickly. But for the overwhelming majority of people, when you put something on the internet, if it's not good in some way, the punishment is that it gets ignored. But the things that are really good, that have real value, they will eventually, in the long run, they do have a tendency to rise to the top, and they will have positive effects. Whereas, the things you do that aren't so hot, generally they just go nowhere. So that's a beautiful asymmetry that people don't realize. But academics and prestige figures, they don't even allow themselves to participate in that beautiful asymmetry, because they have this model in their mind where, like, if they write a blog post that's not that good, someone is going to see that and they're going to judge them as not good because their one blog post wasn't good. Like, a lot of academics have that mentality, and they live in that kind of, it's a real prison cell, I think, to be honest. And so that's why part of what I'm doing is just actively being, like, sometimes every now and then I am actively just preposterously stupid because I'm not I don't want to spend my life kind of maintaining like my image as like super smart. I know I'm pretty fucking smart. I know what I'm capable of. I believe that the good stuff I do that's valuable, will stick around, and it'll be valued and remembered for what it's worth. If it's valuable at all, and if it's not, that's fine. But I'm not going to be like afraid to make huge mistakes, and I'm not going to be afraid to be stupid. I'm going to do whatever the fuck I want, and just, the chips will fall where they may is kind of my attitude.
Yeah. So I think I respect that. I think there's a few things I would pull out of there.
Yeah.
That are somewhat different things going on. So, for instance, the question of saying things that are stupid and then being judged by them, that's definitely something that's going on, where people are holding back from, giving some sort of opinion on a trend or a phenomenon. But so that's definitely the case, and I think we're missing out. And I've seen that especially in design, where maybe even 3-5 years ago, there were a lot more people blogging. There were a lot more people in comment sections giving their opinions, participating, and that's moved a lot to Slack channels and private channels, where there's going to be less judgment about, even I think people were critical of things more than, and I don't think people are less critical. I think they just don't want to be out in public being critical. So that's one aspect. I think there's also the question of dealing with taboo topics. And so it's not necessarily even that you say something stupid. It's just that you say something that most people may not even disagree with, but they may think it's not even they think you're stupid for saying it, although that's part of it. It's more that they think that you're either reckless or dangerous, potentially. These are all factors. And so
yeah,
there's the question of offensiveness as well. To sort of validate what you were saying about things going into the void and things being away, or going away. I forgot her name, Justine Sacco. So she, I believe, for a while, she was the person who made a joke about getting AIDS, I believe, while she was on a plane going to Africa. I'm sure everybody knows this story, but in case one person didn't, I figured I'd mention it. But the main thing with her is, I believe she's now some sort of marketing executive or something major at OkCupid or Match.com or one of these big. I think they're all owned by the same company. I'm pretty sure, like Tinder, Match, and OkCupid. So there's some number of all these dating companies that for some reason all own Christian Mingle. I don't know which ones they are, but there's like 3 of them that are all under the same parent company, even though they have totally different flavors and even different political brands. Basically, like some of them are more conservative and some of them are all very much, for people who have, urban types, like people who may have tattoos and like to go to protests, like that's OkCupid or something, so, but they're all owned by the same company, but that's an aside. But she's, I'm sure she has a very low profile now, but she's still a major figure now, and good for her that she weathered that storm.
Is she doing like consulting on like social media or what?
Oh, I don't think so. I think she's just got a regular job. I don't know how she managed it, and I'm sure there's a story out there because I think there was a book written about her in particular. But
you're saying she didn't fall very far; she just moved laterally, kind of. Is that your?
Hard to say. I really don't know what her career trajectory was going to be and what she wanted it to be. But she's not starving.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I wouldn't. She is one person that I've heard of weathering these things, and it's hard for me to know what is a sort of universalizable rule on how these things end up. And I think it's a little bit too soon to say like, oh, everyone can just, not even because I know you're not being naive and saying, oh, it's just going to work out for everybody. But I almost wonder, is she an anomaly and we shouldn't reference her as being relevant here?
That's a great question. I mean, that's a good case to reflect on, though, because that's interesting to learn that she, made it out okay, and whatever she's doing, maybe it's not what she originally wanted, but she's not starving and she's probably doing quite well. Yeah. So that's a good case for a few reasons. One, because I think she represents a previous era of this
Mm,
problem. I mean,
yeah.
I think the culture wars have evolved a lot over the past few years, even, and in the following way specifically. I think that at first, when the big kind of moral panic of, whatever you want to call it, SJWism or whatever. SJW is like such a corny word, but I just like it because it's short, really. I mean, you can call it whatever you want, but I like that it's 3 letters. It's short, quick, and easy. The whole like SJW moral panic, when it first kind of really became very salient, and you could get, in serious career trouble for like one bad word on Twitter. When that first kind of like became clear through case studies such as Justine Sacco, um, what a lot of the early people who suffered from that kind of mob moral panic did is that they tried to apologize. And I
Mm,
think one of the things that the culture has learned, or that actors have learned from these case studies, is that, if you get in trouble for saying something relatively innocuous, but it's interpreted in a bad way, and you got a big internet mob out to get you for it, one major lesson that's been learned is you don't apologize.
mm,
Um, I think that's a lesson that's been learned. I think the data, the case studies, if you map them out and built a big data set, I think my hypothesis is that it would show quite clearly those who try to back down and apologize and say, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. No, you misunderstood. Let me explain. People who do that generally go down the hardest, I think, or
mm,
they don't do as well through the process as they could. And I think what you're seeing now is that people such as myself, to be perfectly frank, have kind of learned that that's a bad strategy for navigating this world that we're in, and that actually the opposite strategy seems to work quite well. With the opposite strategy being, if you get in trouble for saying something on the internet, you double down on it and you own it and you extrapolate from it and you do more and more in the spirit of the thing that got you in trouble, basically. And I think Donald Trump is basically one big living example of that phenomenon. I think you could think of many other examples. And I'm not like some sinister character. Like, I'm not planning some sort of like rise to power akin to Donald Trump's rise to the presidency. It's nothing at
mm.
all like that. But I've been
That's what you
paying.
say now.
What's that?
That's what you're saying now.
Yeah, well, who knows what the future has in store, but I can assure you I'm not thinking about anything like that. But I've been paying very close attention to the cultural politics of how these things work for sure. And um, what I'm saying right now definitely informs my own strategic choices about what I choose to say and do. And so, like, yeah, for me, like, I feel like I'm kind of, I mean, I'm still hopeful that my little case is gonna not be that big of a deal. And it's not gonna like, yeah, I'd prefer it all to go away. But if it's not gonna go away, and if the institutions are going to bring a big weight onto my shoulders and try to get me in trouble and bring me down or whatever, then I'm gonna pursue the second strategy of the two that I just discussed, which I'm already kind of doing. And I think those cases are the ones where people pull through, and then they end up having some weird kind of like niche doing something based on the internet purely. And so you're kind of like socially ostracized, but you have like an audience, you have a project, you kind of do your thing. And, if you're lucky, there's like, you find an audience that's willing to throw you a little bit of money to help you do it. But it seems like you only get that positive outcome if you hold tight to your freedom to say what you want to say, and whatever it is you got you in trouble, you don't apologize for it, but you defend your right to be who you are. That's how I see it anyway.
Yeah, and it's interesting along the lines of there's the speech aspect, and again, I don't think you fetishize the freedom of speech per se so much as, I mean, I could be wrong here, but it's imaginary in many ways. It's not like there's no enforcement of it other than, I mean, there's some enforcement to some extent, but there's no like natural freedom of speech. But uh, I think it was Zippy who said that it was it's always contingent, basically. Like there's always restriction. Freedom of speech is necessarily restricted speech. And Zippy passed away recently. But the main thing is that, like, of course, freedom of speech is a turn of phrase at the same time as it's like this institutional, meaningful word in that sense. So there's that debate. But when it comes to actually being able to say what you want, there's that sense of being able to just go out and say it. But then there's also, the real constraints on your livelihood and those aspects, which I'm not necessarily as optimistic about what that looks like in today's world. With and that's why I'm a little bit skeptical of Justine Sacco being a relevant case, and so I guess to be seen, right? And I hope it works out for everybody who. Yeah, I mean, I generally try to take ideas from wherever they come, even whether or not they're good or bad ideas, just interesting ones that make me stretch what my thinking is. But I can imagine that we actually don't hear about the people who are totally dead and out and not able to work in the economy. Like, are they really going to come out and talk about what a shitty situation their life has turned into because of the internet? I mean, maybe there's a couple of those people, but who would be willing to come out, but probably they're somewhat ashamed of what's become of themselves. And yeah, it's kind of, I wonder, but maybe they would go on a sympathy campaign and say, do a Kickstarter for me. Who knows? I don't know, or a GoFundMe, something. But I guess I feel like we've got a handful of people that have gone through this, that have been public about what's happened, and there's probably hundreds of people who, in various subcultures that we've probably never even heard of, those subcultures are totally, their lives actually were ruined and they never came back from it.
Right. Well, you're definitely right that there are people whose lives have been ruined, like, emotionally, because they were actually really invested in a particular type of community, and there was like a witch hunt against them, and they were chastised and chased out and ashamed, public shaming campaigns. So I think that's something, there's definitely cases of that, like on the activist left, for sure. There's some that are fairly well known, and then there's a bunch that aren't well known at all. So yeah, but I think that's like, it's more emotional than it is like financial. So like we're kind of thinking about two different, we're now talking about like two very different types of falls from grace, so like you and I are, like professionals, right? With like careers. And so that's a particular type of case. But then there's like people who just in their friend group or something, like maybe they don't have a career, they just have like a regular job or whatever in a particular area, but they're like active with an activist group, or they're just friends with people. There definitely have been cases of people whose reputations have been destroyed through like witch hunt campaigns that are just like basically libelous, overzealous, like sociological herd dynamics taking over and scapegoating someone. So I think I'm not making light of that at all. That's huge and negative, and there are many cases of that, and that can destroy someone's life for sure. So your larger point is well taken, that there are people who have suffered tremendously from the kind of moral panic that we're living through right now. And you just don't hear about those people. I think you're absolutely right. But I guess in my view, I'm hopeful that we are kind of right now going through a kind of turning point, I think, or at least what I'm doing with my own moment and kind of having this type of conflict thrust upon me is like, I think that there's a certain way that people now can kind of learn what's going on, can learn from the cases of Justine Sacco and learn from the previous cases of people who have had their lives destroyed. And I think like we're starting to see through it. I think people really are starting to see, okay, this is like a fucked up moral panic. It's really insane and it's unfair, and it's just ultimately stupid. Like ultimately it doesn't make sense. And if you're smart and you have a strong conscience and you know what you're doing and you know that you're not a bad person, well then from here on out, I think you're going to see more and more people saying like, wait a second, no, fuck you. Don't try this with me. You're barking up the wrong tree. If you try to shut me down or you try to like punish me or destroy my career or say I'm a bad person because I said some stupid word. Like, no, I see this coming. You're stupid. Here's why you're stupid. I'm doing something different. Here's why I'm doing it. And I think, like, I don't know. It looks to me like the tide is turning, where if you do what I just said, you're going to kind of win. I don't know if that's true, but that's like my hypothesis. And it's certainly, I'm putting my money where my mouth is and how I'm acting. Do you know what I mean? And so I think that's more and more the case. I think people are seeing that. And once that becomes true, maybe we're not there yet. Maybe I'm premature, and maybe I'm making the wrong decision, and I'm going to go down badly, and I'm never going to work again. And I'll be remembered as that guy whose reputation was destroyed and who disappeared. Maybe. But even if I'm wrong and I'm a little premature, I'm quite confident that what I'm saying and the wager that I'm making, it's at the very least, it will soon be true. I think. I think it's increasingly moving there, and I think it only happens by people taking the wager themselves and doing the kind of strategy that I'm doing. I don't think I'm going to single-handedly do anything, but I think, like, we learn from each other very rapidly, and stuff spreads way more rapidly than it used to. So I guess, like, I'm kind of bullish, to be honest. I'm bullish on the culture markets. I think that, like, radical independent thought is flourishing, to be honest. And I think there's been a major slump with the kind of moral panic, but I think, like, we might very well right now be living through a threshold in which it's rapidly being kind of overturned and replaced by uncontrollable forces of intellectual escape and exit, and new communities and energies building on that. I'm quite bullish on that, I think.
Well, I think you're right that eventually, it won't. It's hard to predict whether it will normalize for everyone, in the sense that everyone just all of a sudden, or even gradually, agrees that, somebody said something that they may or may not regret, but was out of the Overton window. So now, maybe things will change so that that's not a life sentence or whatever. But so I actually agree with the optimism. Who knows what the timeline of that is?
Right.
And I guess it's kind of a question of seeing more good examples, right? So Justine Sacco is a good example. Let's see more of those. Let's see more people surviving and going on to do great things, and turning out to be complex people who are worth listening to. Sometimes they say crazy shit, and sometimes they are going to provoke you, and that's what you want because you're curious. And having more people, not even necessarily, there's this whole question of anonymity being bad, or people need to start being more brave and come out. No, I would disagree with that. But I think the people who are anonymous, I think they don't necessarily need to be public figures themselves, but more so in their life, kind of pushing boundaries and saying, have you read about this? Have you seen about this content? And this isn't some play like, oh, read my book because it's so dangerous. No, that's not what I'm saying here. But although please read my book, that would be great. But it's more, it doesn't take some grand gesture of, burning out for things to change. And I do actually see more lately, and this could be self-selecting, where first of all, I live in a very strange place where I'm confronted by radical people on all parts of the spectrum. I mean, Austin, Texas is just this weird mix of, conservative red America and, like, very blue liberal America. And so I meet people of all stripes who will give me, I've had libertarians, communists, very right-wing people, people who are into guns, whatever it might be, all kind of divulging their thinking with me. And, it doesn't even matter what they think I think. More so, people are just getting more comfortable, like, in personal life, sort of testing those boundaries and saying, like, oh, well, here's what I've been thinking about. Are you going to judge me for this? And it's like, well, no, I'm going to actually hear you out because I think you might have something cool to say about that.
That's a really good point, actually. I think there's a lot of that going on under the surface right now. You're right. And it's not necessarily in public. And you also said something very true, that so much conversation right now is happening in private forums right now. Like, people think that everyone's on Twitter and on Facebook, but they're not. Like, people are afraid to say what they think on Twitter and Facebook, but there's loads of people in Slack channels and Discord servers and private DM groups. and that's where people are actually working out what they really think, and they're learning to share it, and they're learning that they're not alone, and other people think it also. And yeah, I think you're totally right. So I think we're overdue for a a cascade. I think like the preference falsification has gone well beyond its peak, I think. And I think like the preference falsification isn't going to be able to hold much longer. I think like there's too much opportunity. There's too many people actually talking with each other about what they really think for the mass aggregate falsified preference projection to last much longer, I think. So I'm quite bullish on that, but only time will tell. But those are very good points for thinking about the larger model at play, I think. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah.
Dude,
It's exciting times.
It's very exciting times, man. And especially for things like this. Like, I mean, I've been enjoying so much doing these streams. And so thanks so much for, contributing to this one. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah, there's a lot of fun.
Yeah, we went quite a long time. It's like more than 2 hours now.
Cool.
So
well,
yeah, man, thanks again. And it was good to meet you and good to chat with you. And why don't you we should plug your book one more time. The link is in the description if you're interested in like Eli's shit. Check out the description, check out his book. I think what is it? EliSchiff.com, right?
Yep, that's the one.
Cool, dude. Well, this has been very interesting and edifying.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing what comes next.
Yeah, man. I'll be in touch with you. I'll see you around the interwebs.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks again, dude. See you later.
Thanks.
See you, man.